everyone. So hi, welcome to this third day of the Digital Demography online course. The subject of our session today is digital trace data, which if you have been following or have come across research that we would classify in as digital demography, it's likely that this was using some kind of digital trace data. So this session is structured in a similar way as yesterday's session, but I have left more time for discussion because this is maybe more than yesterday. We will be engaging also with issues of confidentiality and kind of digital ethics. The way that I thought we could do this is I'm going to give you a short introduction about this digital trace data, which is going to be roughly half of our session. Then we're going to have a short break, as we did yesterday. And then we're going to discuss two cases in depth. So basically the two studies that you reviewed for today, and then we'll have a discussion about this. So it depends how we do with the times. Maybe we're going to start a bit earlier with the discussion, but I hope that we'll have time for that. And the dynamic is the same as yesterday. So just feel free to send a text to the chat anytime you want to add something or just interrupt. And then we're also going to have this discussion segment where I will ask some of you to elaborate more on some subjects, but everyone can write to the chat. Okay, I think that is enough introduction. So as I mentioned, we're going to look at two examples and then have a discussion. But we'll start with the short Q&A session. So I would just like to get a general sense if maybe everyone can just write in the chat whether you had the chance to look at the FamilyLinks data and at least do something with the exercise one. So if you could just type quickly, so people who are just auditing are not working with the exercise, so that's fine. But I just want to get a sense how you're doing with this. And also, if there's something else you want to bring up, just send it to the chat. So, okay. All right, so we're gonna have a couple of minutes, maybe until 11:40. So if you wanna share anything, just type it there. And also remember that you can always get in touch and we can book an office hour if you want to discuss something more in depth. Yeah, okay. So there are some issues if you are. So I only gave you a subset of the data. If you want to look at the whole data set, then you can run into issues when trying to open it in your computer. And the reason for that, like we can discuss this, Madalena, if you want, is that it's such a large data set. So I don't remember the exact size, but it's several gigabytes. And that is when you open it in R, in your interactive session, that is loaded to memory. And it's very likely that the memory in your computer is enough to store that. So normally you would read it in chunks, or you would just use a remote server. But we can have a chat about that. Okay, so I see like no major issues. So let's just go on. Sorry about that. Okay. Right. So we're gonna start with a bit of definition of what digital trace data are. So maybe the main message is that digital trace data are inevitable when we use the online world. Not only is it inevitable, but it's often invisible to us. Right? So it's often this, we use the metaphor of digital breadcrumbs, which are that you leave behind as you use the internet, as you use your devices. At least for Europe, so the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, introduced several checks and in an attempt to ensure that users had more control over their data and the way it is used. But it's still kind of difficult to regulate these things. And outside of Europe, it's much less regulated. But the important thing for us, I think, to understand as researchers is that these platforms, like this digital trace data that is collected by companies, it is mainly marketing led. What I mean by this is that it's not collected for social scientific research. Right? So maybe companies would use it for their own internal research or marketing research, but it often doesn't meet the criteria that we would wish from our data sources. And when I say companies, I mean companies, and this is another distinction from more traditional. So I would also call this IRL data in this session. So like in real life data, like surveys or censuses, which are normally produced by government or often produced by public institutions that are accountable somehow. But these digital crumbs are digital trace data is produced by private companies that have no accountability to us as researchers, other than us as consumers. Okay, so I'm gonna speak about 3 types of digital trace data. So the first one is marketing platforms, and in demography, when we think of these platforms, we are usually speaking about this Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp combination. So now these 3 companies, platforms, are now owned by Facebook. So there is this advertisement platform that we're gonna focus on this advertisement platform throughout the day. So I'm not gonna say too much about it now, but it is perhaps the most widely used currently in demographic digital trace data. But there are other advertisement platforms. LinkedIn, I mentioned 2 days ago, and so the basic idea of these advertisement platforms is going to be covered in a couple of slides. So I probably should not get ahead of myself. So the second type of data source are so online platforms and sort of communication platforms. So the most widely used is Twitter, and the difference, and then we also have Google Trends or emails, IP addresses, mobile phone data. So the difference between the advertisement platforms and these online platforms, so the first and the second data source, is that the advertising platforms, what they do is they provide a service that is not aimed at us as researchers, but it is aimed at private companies or political parties or anyone who wants to put an ad out there and wants to target consumers. So the companies do this and we're going to speak about micro-targeting in a bit, but in an attempt to locate those users that are more likely to be interested in a certain product, then the platforms do some data crunching to be able to serve these ads to these people. Right? So we are in a way making use of that effort for research. So now when we think of this second type of source, this is closer to raw data. So Twitter, for example, you can collect tweets that people have posted, public tweets. So this is all public information. And you can choose like to filter it by time, by hashtag, by location, and by many other characteristics. But this is not pre-processed by Twitter. You just get the raw data. So Google Trends is a bit different because you get information about search terms, but these search terms are not. They are not meant directly for advertisement purposes, right? So you can check if you want to see how often people search for different keywords over time, and I would encourage you to take a look. It's a great resource, and it's free. It's super easy to use. You can compare over time different keywords in different languages, and this is aggregated data. Of course, it's many millions of search queries. And it's also retrospective, right? So we spoke about this online data being always on. So this is one example of it being always on, that you can go back and see what people are searching now, but also what they were searching, I don't know, 3 years ago. To make comparisons and maybe establish control groups and things like this. So the third type that it's not so common is this email, IP addresses, mobile phones. So the reason why this is not so common is that it is controlled by companies, and there are many reasons why companies would not share this data related to the privacy of the users, but also related to their commercial market value. And so sometimes you see these studies, and the main reason is that there is some kind of agreement between the company and the researcher where they are allowed access to this data. But this links to another discussion about the reproducibility of results. Right? If as a researcher you were granted a one-time access to some information and it's impossible, you're not allowed to share that, then how is the scientific community supposed to check your results? And if it cannot be replicated also, so that's another issue. But these are less common because it's more like one-to-one agreement, but they can be very, very useful. So, so another type of data that is used in digital demography are, so it's the Internet of Things, right? So we defined the Internet of Things 2 days ago as including these objects that are now Internet enabled and can connect and send data about the way that they are used. So these include activity trackers, wearable medical devices, sensors. So there's a lot of very interesting research being done about sensors. There was a paper that came out yesterday in Science where they were using apps also to track the contact and try to model the infection dynamics of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so because we are kind of in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, then so we are also seeing these things come out where these partnerships are created between the private companies and governments in an attempt to, and this is something that has been done in Asia much more than in Europe, where you would, because these digital traces of our online existence, they are out there, and they can be used. For example, if you know that this person has been infected, then you can trace their movement over time, and this could help warn others that may have come in contact with them. And this back tracing of the chain of contagion can be made more efficient if you have this mobile phone data, right? So this is like this is something that many people have been very wary of, with good reason, but now it has been used, and governments have been contemplating this sort of extreme measures given the current situation that we are in. So this is something I took from Twitter a couple of days ago, where this is a private company that produces smart thermometers. So I don't know if you've seen them, but these are basically fancy thermometers that are connected to the internet, and so you can collect the information on temperature, which is the yellow line here, and then you can compare it to what you would expect, and then like that would give you an indication of whether like the average temperature in people's bodies is higher than you would expect, like in the absence of a pandemic. So as I understand, this is like hasn't really been peer reviewed or anything. So it's just like an example of the way in which these new technologies are enabling new ways of thinking about this phenomenon. Okay, so I think that is enough about the data sources. So we've discussed these 3 potential sources of information for online demography, digital demography: marketing platforms, online platforms, and the Internet of Things. And we're not going to focus on the 3 today because there's not enough time. And I think we'll probably get the most out of our time if we just choose one, which is going to be the marketing platforms. I'm going to say a couple of things about this advertisement platforms in case you haven't used them. I think that you have been part of them, even if you're not aware of it. And if you're a Facebook user, say in this case, so the basic idea of these advertisement platforms is that you can target your ad to the specific audience. This is an example of what this audience estimates look like. So in this case, I was interested in showing a potential ad to people who were living within 40 kilometers of Guatemala City and who were aged, so you can see that here, and who were aged between 18 and 65, for example, and who were in all gender. I could have specified more criteria, like which languages they speak, what kind of device they use. But this is, say, the most basic of queries. And when you do this, then well, you get this meter of like how well defined, like the more characteristics you have, the more potential for micro-targeting there is. But if you get too specific, then the number is gonna drop below a certain number of people who meet this criteria, and then like there's a threshold under which you don't get any precise estimates because it's rounded up. But in this case, so the reach, the estimated daily reach was between 7 and 22,000 people who met this criteria. Right, so this is like one way in which you can get a quick estimate of the number of Facebook users and that meet the characteristics. And if you were an actual company interested in placing an ad, then you'd say, okay, this is the population I want, and you just move on and you design your ad and then you pay Facebook to do it. But we are not going to do that. Here, I specified it a bit more. I'm no longer interested only in these age groups, but I want only men. I am interested in these age groups, sorry, but I now want only men. So you can see that the reach changes. And then, sorry, I forgot to mention. So here you have the potential reach. So this is like how many people actually do meet these characteristics. And here we have 3,700,000 Facebook users. And if we only restrict it to men, then we only have 2 million. So like most studies are using this number. And then we do the same, but only for women. So now we only have 1.7 million. Out of whom we could expect that between 8 and 20,000 are gonna be daily users. So this is the basic intuition behind the data that was used by the two studies that you had to read today. So this is how they got that information. And you see it's very basic demographic information, but it can be very useful. And the interesting thing is that this is, for example, a subnational estimate. So it is not for the whole country, but it is for a specific area, in this case, a city, not even a region, but a specific city. And that's what these studies were doing. And so there are other characteristics that we're not considering here, but we're gonna get back to that. Okay, so the way that we obtain this data from the Facebook marketing platform. So there are these two acronyms, GUI versus API. So GUI is a graphical user interface. So this is basically what we were doing here. Like you can obtain these numbers one by one if you open the website and then you click on it and there's like a menu and then you put the age ranges by hand, or you can automate this process and use an API, which is, as we discussed yesterday, this way of interacting, in this case with the Facebook marketing platform, in a programmatic way. So there are no menus, there are no buttons to click, but you program the specific commands that then you send to the API, and this API is going to understand them with the parameters. So for example, you can tell the Facebook API, okay, I want to know how many men there are between 15 and 20. And then another query is going to be 20, 25 years, another 25, 30. And then you automate all of these requests and you send them, and then you get the results back. Like very simplified, but that's the idea. So it's more efficient. And if you saw Sophie's tutorial, then this is basically what Sophie is showing you here. So this is how to use this automated API to access the audience estimates from Facebook, not by hand, but by but through, in this case, R. And there's also one for Python. So it's this is a very good tutorial. So if you're interested in doing this, I would totally recommend that you try out the exercises. Of course, you can do it by hand, but if you want to, so what the advantage of the API is that you can just program it and let it run, but also you can establish regular data collection processes. So if you remember in the paper by Monica Alexander and Emilio Tagani, so they speak about waves. Like they collected Facebook data in waves. Is it because you are collecting the same data at one time point, then you do the same again, and then you do the same again, and this is like equivalent to survey waves. Okay, so now we're gonna have a bit of time for. So if there are any questions, we can discuss them. But also we're gonna do something similar to what we did yesterday, and so basically, I would like you to take 5 minutes to look at these questions, and then just everyone please write to the chat what you think about them, and then I'm gonna ask some people to elaborate a bit more on that, and we can see how the discussion goes. So before that, I mentioned this idea of micro-targeting. So Facebook audience estimates are very good for this micro-targeted advertisement. And what I mean by micro-targeting is this marketing strategy that uses digital trace to segment audiences into small groups for content targeting, right? So this can be, and the content is a variable that can be either like someone selling shoes or someone being shown a political campaign by a left-wing government, or someone asked to fill in a survey, for example. So please think about these two questions. The first one, how can micro-targeted advertisement be useful for demographic research? And what are like the great things that we can get from it, and what are some of the things that are not so great if we were to use this for research? So it's 12:02 here. Say until like 12:07 we can continue the discussion. So just send your thoughts to the chat, please. And then for you to prepare, these are the 3 people that were randomly chosen. And this is including the people who were already chosen yesterday. So there might be some overlap, but yeah, so Tavio, Niall, and Andres. So please get going.
So, Diego, one thing that wasn't clear, like we wait 5 minutes or we start now and then we have the break?
No, sorry, yeah. So we start now. We finish part of the class with this exercise and then we have the break. And you have 5 minutes to think about the questions and send the chat.
Okay. What do you think, guys, about it? No. Yeah, that was intended. Because I want to see what you think as well. Like I'm thinking basically for, I don't know, new migrants, for instance, like how new migrants build communities in the new destination places. Kind of content targeting or targeting advertisements that help them to build social networks. I don't know if you had that things in mind or not, but I think that could be a possibility.
Yeah, so I would say, like, you can think of what is interesting for you or for your research. Like, doesn't have to, like, be in line with mine. And yeah, just like think about it for a while, send something to the chat, and then we can have an open discussion.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so we have some chats coming in already. Okay, so some very good points about knowledge production from Andres, and luckily you are on the list, so we're gonna get to hear more about this. So Luca mentioning how you can reach very small populations, provided that they are Facebook users and they can be found, right? So maybe like one of the variables that you're interested in is not necessarily a part of the variables that is available for targeting. Yes, so I guess you mean look at by asking them surveys, if you think of nuptiality in this thing. So yeah. And then Heiner, yeah, mentioned, so again, the possibilities of surveys plus the algorithmic drifting that we have discussed. And this is something that we're gonna come back to. Like, we don't know how these things are gonna change over time. And so we do, like, yeah, so in terms of algorithmic drifting, there is this idea is like, we don't know how Facebook pre-process the data, but the drifting part is like, we don't know how they process it then, and if it's the same as how they are processing it now. I don't want to preempt our other discussion, but this is mentioned in the Puerto Rico paper also. Okay, so we're gonna wrap up. Like, if you have something, please continue sending to the chat, but we are gonna start with Octavio. So do you want to give us like a brief summary of what you were thinking?
Yeah, that's what I put in the chat. Maybe the biggest advantage that this could offer for demographic research is like that you can easily, relatively easily access very specific populations that are not easily gathered by a traditional method. Say, I don't know, nuptiality of a specific community in a country. That may be easily underrepresented in a survey, but now you can basically get to a higher population. However, like selection bias still could exist because it's kind of dependent on everyone using the platform. And also, well, we demographers always think about collecting data. And maybe collecting data from a survey, from a Facebook survey could be super worried to many people for, I would say, obvious reasons. This provides you like a very interesting opportunity to expand actually the demographic topics into small populations. That's what I think I see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. Thank you. So, Niall, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think I was thinking along the same lines of Octavio. Really, I was thinking how it could be useful for data collection, for selecting specific groups of a population which are of interest to the researcher. Mainly, through survey selection. What I was thinking, maybe we can tailor our sample based upon specific users, based on their browsing habits or whatever they're searching for, or I was thinking along those sort of lines. But again, we would maybe be excluding certain people that don't use these platforms.
So which platforms were you thinking?
Also along the lines of Facebook and things like this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So Andres, maybe we collect everything and then we can have a general discussion.
Okay, so I think the benefits of this strategy are kind of well understood. To me, it seems to be an easier, fast way of obtaining data. And then what you do with the bias or with the selection, that's, your role as researchers, you might correct or adjust for this, or simply adjust your research goals. So in that sense, it seems to me very positive strategy. But then on the other hand, I was wondering if it's are not problematic the role that big companies could have in this kind of research, because it seemed to me that they have a very strong role in defining the research possibilities that one can have. And if that's the case, because at the end they decide the variables, they decide what can you ask and what you cannot ask. So that seems to me a bit problematic if there is a cost associated to this, because my sense is that if there is a negotiation process between the researchers and these companies, then the bargaining power of what I was writing there, middle or low rank universities in the global south might be lower compared to the other places like our institute, that will have the financial capacity to negotiate with these companies massive strategy of data collection. And also I was wondering, for an individual researcher, this could be even more complicated, right? So I don't know if it's worth thinking about this potential issues and the consequence that it may have for inequalities in knowledge production, because we shouldn't forget that we are talking about social sciences, and in this sense, the production of knowledge in the social science helps to not only understand reality, but also to construct reality. So who are going to be the producers of this social reality is an interesting question to ask in this frameworks.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all. That's like great points. So first I would say, so Heiner was also following up here asking about so this idea of targeting and how hard to reach populations might also be hard to reach in Facebook. For example, people over 100. So like probably you don't want to use Facebook to reach this population. Like one precondition, as I was saying last time, for you being able to reach a certain group is that it is at all represented on Facebook, and some of them. So like you have to use the right tool for the job, and like maybe for some of these cases it's simply not the right tool. So coming back to Andres, so the point of Andres about so inequalities in the production of knowledge, if we think between the global north and global south, are of course real, and access to prestige and financial resources determining them, and like of course determined them also before the advent of digital trace data. So the question, I guess, is whether it is intensified or exacerbated by these platforms. And I would say like maybe like two points to that answer. So the first one is, so what we've been discussing here and the readings that I recommended and that we're going to discuss in a bit are all related to, so the Facebook advertisement platform is free and open to everyone. And so you have the access to it to the same extent that the authors of the papers did. And that seems fair, and I think that's the kind of studies that are most useful, because you can have the study, that has access to like telecom data from 5 big telecom providers because it is a famous university that paid them a lot, and this is not reproducible, and it is very restrictive. But if we look at the advertisement platforms, for now they're open. Like Twitter data is open to everyone. Everyone has the same access. Of course, if you have resources, you can purchase databases that include more detail, or like not in the sense that they go further back in time, for example. So financial resources are always going to give you a head start. I don't know of any research looking at whether the head start is larger for digital trace data than for other types of data. So I can look into this, but I think it's definitely something that needs to be studied more. Okay, so we're gonna take a short break now, 5 minutes. So I'll see you back at 12:22, where we're gonna have a discussion about the readings. Oh, right, sorry. Okay, no, it doesn't matter. Yeah, let's meet at 22. Okay, welcome back. We are now going to start with the second part of the course. So what I want us to do now is to focus on 2 studies and then have a discussion about them. I think the discussion is the most interesting part. So I have prepared some slides where I'll just refresh your memory about some points about these studies, but I would like us really to focus on evaluating the way that digital trace data is used in each of them. The first one is an example of migration, and before we start, at the end of this short presentation, we are gonna review the strengths and the weaknesses of the use of digital trace data in these 2 studies. So I would like you to think of this as we go through the next slides, and in particular, I would like Marilena and Margarita to think of these 2 in terms of the gender gap study. So this is the second one, and Miguel and Rustam to think of the strengths and weaknesses of digital trace data for the migration study. So Miguel and Rustam are going to be the experts on the migration study, and Marilena and Margarita are going to be the experts on the gender gap study. But of course, you all are welcome to write your thoughts about this. Okay, so the migration study. Basically, the authors were interested in estimating migration from Puerto Rico in the months after the Hurricane Maria in 2017. And they combined data from the Facebook advertisement platform and the American Community Survey. And they found an increase in Puerto Rican migrants comparing to periods, so 17%, so migrants in the US. And then they also documented this return migration with a decrease in Puerto Rican migrants in the US. And they characterized the flows by age, sex, and US state. So one thing they do initially is they compare the age distribution of the Puerto Rican migrants, so here in red, by state, to the age distribution of the population in coming from real world survey data. Right, so this is the problem of representativity that they address with the difference in difference analysis, and they document this change in population by state. Right, so this is like very short summary, and they find this percentage change by age, and they also give a number of 180,000 migrants. Okay, so this is like first study. The second study is so now we shift our focus, and the population becomes the internet users. And the idea is to predict the internet and mobile phone use gender gaps. And so now we are interested in the people who are using these digital sources and how the distribution between gender, how we can estimate this distribution by gender. And they use Facebook advertising platform and also some indicators coming from more traditional offline sources. And what they basically do is estimate this Facebook gender gap index, where they look at the female to male ratio of people who have a characteristic, and then they weigh that by the ratio of the population to account for the sum of the population structure of each country. So one of the findings is that this Facebook-based measure accounts for 69% of the variance in the ground truth indicator of this gender gap, online gender gap. And one of their conclusions is that the measures that work best are those that combine online and offline data, right? And this is like something that we can come back to in the discussion. And here there is also this companion website that I asked you to look at. If you haven't, you can just click on the link. It's quite a nice website, and then you can see this real-time nowcasting of the digital gender gap based on the API So it's constantly collecting data from Facebook and then updating the website. Okay, so this was like just a couple of minutes. This should be quite fresh. So you read it recently. So just to review, what I would like us to do now is to take 5 minutes again to identify the strengths and the weaknesses of the use of digital trace data in these two studies. And so focus on like what did we do, what did they do that would not have been possible to do without this, or what were you convinced by how did they deal with the issue of bias? How were you convinced by that? What are shortcomings? So like a general assessment, but not necessarily of the study in itself, but of their use of the digital trace data. So it's is it clear? If it's not clear, can someone say, please?
I think it's clear. Thanks.
Okay, great. So just work on this for like 5 minutes. It's 12:28 now. So until 12:33, I'll let you know, and you can send things to the chat as you write them. Like this can be like a brainstorming session. It doesn't have to be a super like, finalized thought. Okay. Yeah, so there's an issue that we haven't discussed so far that Madalena brought up, that is fake accounts and bots. I think someone mentioned it yesterday. So we can speak about that. So Ilgi also bringing up this issue of how do the algorithms actually work. Yeah, we can discuss this for sure. So maybe Miguel and Rustam, you can start getting ready in 1 or 2 minutes.
I can start now.
Let's just wait 1 minute for like, everyone to stop their like writing what they're thinking. Okay. Yeah, Rustam, I think that was here.
Yeah, so talking about the study, what seems very important to me as well. First of all, we have to say that the authors themselves, they acknowledge the fact that relying on the data drawn from Facebook or any other social media, they indeed have the drawbacks. For example, it's very difficult, or it's very difficult to control the data samples. In that we know that the use of any social platform, and Facebook as well, is limited in certain countries, and the representativeness of the general population may be broken. In addition to that, I should say that it should be also very difficult to test the data for accuracy. Although what I mean is that the algorithm, we don't really know how it works, the Facebook algorithm of data generation in that sense. So it's a black box. However, what I think is very good is that, well, as Monica said, basically they don't use the raw Facebook data per se. They actually somehow check the data quality, as far as I understood. So the fact that they did check if these fluctuations observed in migrant populations that were revealed by the ads manager are not for the program, like for the changes in program, changes in algorithm itself. And I think it's very good. And I also think that it's very nice. The migration data are not readily available anywhere. And what they did, I mean, this data are a very good proxy, allowing you to do like some interesting research. That's what I have to say.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. So you brought up this issue of the algorithmic accountability that also Maralina and others mentioned in the chat. And this other issue that I think you mentioned related to this algorithmic drifting, where, so they mentioned in the paper that there appears to be this general increase in the migrant population, and like everywhere. So that might actually be caused by changes in the internal algorithm that like we don't understand, but maybe we can account for. So do you want to add something, Miguel?
Yeah. I am thinking in the big data is, for example, Facebook is very useful to cover the lags in registered data. I mean, in the case of internal migration, for example, of young population between 20 and 35 years old, the sub-register is more or less about 50%, I think, in the SPENCAS study. And it will be useful if we can use a source like Facebook to measure this gap, to study internal migration and to compare with the registered data in these ages.
Mm-hmm. So this idea of, so I guess like there are two things you can do with real world data. One of them is compare, and the other one is complement your finding. And like one theme that runs through both papers is that complementing seems to be a very good option, if not the best option. Okay, so what about like maybe Rustam or Miguel or anyone else wants to jump in? So what about some negative aspects of the way in which the data is used that like you were particularly bothered by?
Can you repeat, please?
Yeah. So what about some negative aspects, some of the weaknesses of the approach? So it's good because it's up to date, and we get very timely estimates. So some of the downsides include representativity, for example. So did you think of any other weaknesses of their reliance on digital trace data?
Yeah, I think that in the way that I talked before, the main weakness is that you don't have all population in these cases. You have a big cover, like I think 70% or more, but you don't have all population, but you could solve this with weights. No? If 60% of population of 70 or the percentage that really is use Facebook in these cases, you can apply a weight after that, no, to compensate.
Yeah. So like one issue here is that because you are interested in a mobile population and you don't really know, like it's kind of like the weight is part of your output. So like you want to know who moved, but you don't know who moved. So it's like you have the weights of the population in the origin and in the destination, but like you don't have the weights for the flow, right? Which is kind of you're interested in. And so here you can see now on the screen some of the like what I think are cons and what I think are pros. So I think it's a very good paper. Like there are more cons I can see now, but so like the way, okay, so let's start with the fact that there is no ground truth data to compare it against. So we have the ACS data, but that is not really a ground truth that we compare it against. Like they use it for other purposes, such as getting estimates of the size of the flow. The sample is not representative. There is this algorithmic drifting that you already mentioned, where like one thing that we don't know, and someone mentioned here, Ilgi mentioned, is that like we don't know what they mean, like what is a migrant, and this is quite of a large discussion in the Facebook user, like academic user community, and you find like traces in different papers. So there is another paper for, I think it was an optional paper for today. This one, Spiratos et al. In +1. So they have good insights about what this, like how Facebook defines migrants, but it changes constantly, and like you usually rely on like people who have some kind of special insight or who spend a lot of time trying to figure this out, but it's not stable, right? So that's the problem. So real-time data, we already mentioned this. Like there's no equivalent in the real world. Yeah. So Heiner mentions that it would have been better if they had collected data every day. So I'm not entirely familiar with why the data collection is structured in the way that it was, and this is also something that is not directly discussed in the study. So I can't say much about it, but yeah, it's also like there is really no standard for like how these waves should be collected of online data because it's so new. So this is also something that is being created as like now. Like there's different studies that are like contributing to creating this standard, but yeah, it's true. Like it's not very transparent about why. So in the way that they adjust for bias, so one way Miguel was mentioning post-stratification, where you apply weights that are somehow proportional to the real population, to the proportion of certain characteristics between your sample and the real population. So now it's a bit more tricky because it's not like we don't have these weights for the flows, and we don't want to impose weights that are going to bias our estimates, right? Like maybe we think that, actually like more women migrate normally, so we're just going to apply a higher weight for women, but maybe that was not the case here. So what they do is they come with this clever difference in difference approach, where you actually only look at percentages. Like,
sorry,
yeah.
I referred before that in Facebook you have maybe 70% of the population in this age. You can compare how many people are living in the same place as birth, and compare it to the registered data. For example, if you have in Facebook 40% of population living in a different place of birth, and in the register you have 30, it supposes that you have a sub-register of 10%.
Okay, I see. So you mean like the pre-migration?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But then you would assume, but you cannot apply any weights to the flow, right? Or unless you assume that the flow has a similar age, sex, let's say, composition that the population of origin.
But
let's say you're just going to bump everything up by 10%.
In this case, you are working with Facebook like a stock, because if you have the place of residence and the place of birth, it's more like a stock, not like a flow. I don't know if I am explaining myself well.
Yeah. So like there's another issue, and they mentioned it, that like you don't actually have flow data for Facebook, right? So what you have are stocks that you observe in different times, and you assume that so there was this migrant stock in a given state in the US, and then that changed, and you assume that the change is due to a flow, right? So you assume that the flow is like the result of, is a difference between the stocks at different times, and this is an issue which is made even worse by the fact that you don't know like how representative each cell of your population is of the population, of the actual population, like your Facebook population of your real population. Okay, so I think we're going to move on to the next paper because of time. So this is the migration study. Okay, I'm going to show this. Yeah, so basically maybe Margarita or Maralina, do you want to give us some quick introduction to what you thought?
Well, firstly, there are things that have been already mentioned as general advantages or weaknesses of using digital trace data. In advantages, it is of course the fact that digital data offers access to estimates or possibility to calculate estimates in places where traditional data is not available. And here it's for the digital gender gap. It is important because it usually, even if data is available, it's not available. So even if data regarding access to internet, for instance, is available, it won't be disaggregated by gender or by subnational units, something that digital data allows us to do or offers. And then as drawbacks, things that have been discussed, the algorithm and the change in algorithm. Then in the article was mentioned as well, misreporting of gender, fake accounts, and the colleagues already said that different platforms have different participants, maybe, and then you have issues of representativity. Facebook would offer data on some population, whereas maybe Twitter or Gmail or other platforms on others. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, me too. I don't think I have other things to add, because I think we covered more or less what was in the article. So I'm okay.
All right, thanks. So I can just put this in the background, and what I see as some pros and cons. But if there's someone else who wants to jump in, please do so. So what do we have in this study? Like, what does this study bring to the table that the previous study didn't? I guess is the question. Okay, so I see some people are typing. In the meantime, I'm gonna mention one thing that is kind of hidden in the presentation of the results, but it's actually quite important. So they mentioned that they have no data for China because the Facebook penetration rate is very low, and this is a big thing. Right? China it's a large country. Many people. So these platforms like reach is also something that we haven't really discussed too much, like penetration, who uses this, and like how the penetration, our reliance on these platforms might systematically undercount certain groups. Like in this case, based on nationality and like ability to access data. We spoke about knowledge production, but also like who counts, right? and who is counted is important. Okay, so Andreas, you mentioned that direct comparison with ground truth data. You mean like as a pro, or like that was missing?
I was trying to reply to your question of what this study brings compared to the previous one. So I didn't see in the other one a direct comparison with ground truth data, which is something they do in this second paper.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
And I see it as a positive thing, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so one thing that they find, and I think it's a strong message, is that combining data, like you get the best estimates when you combine data. So I don't think that many digital demographers actually think that we should just get rid of the traditional data sources. But like a consistent finding is that we can amplify the things that we get from traditional sources with online sources. So nowcasting is, as Aina mentioned, it's very prevalent, very visible contribution of the digital trace data, and the fact that you can establish this platform of like constant monitoring. Okay, so I'm going to move ahead to the last slides now. If wants to add something, please say so. But I want to mention some of the challenges going ahead. And I really like this quote. I don't know if you like theater, but so there's this quote from A Streetcar Named Desire that says, "I've always depended on the kindness of strangers." And I think this is a very good metaphor to describe our relationship to these companies as researchers. So we depend on their kindness to ensure a sustainable data access. And this is maybe one of like the weak links in the chain that some data access might change, and we're not necessarily informed about this or about the changes in the internal working of the platforms. So one of the big challenges is how do we address the systematic bias, and we've seen different ways of addressing it. And how can we create partnerships maybe with some of these companies to be kept in the loop a bit more about these exchanges in algorithms, for example. And of course, so there is the issue of privacy and ethical digital research. It wouldn't seem that the kind of data that we're discussing is aggregated, and we don't really have access to any individual level data. So there is no way of identifying any individuals. So there are similar safeguard measures put in place to the ones that you get when you are working with register data, where if the count of a given cell drops below a number, then you cannot ask Facebook to tell you how many people there are if it is below 1,000, I think. So anything below 1,000 just gives you 1,000, and there are all other rounding tricks so that you cannot actually see uniquely identified people from this data, but relying on these platforms that have been used on micro-targeting, for example, has been used for political advertisement and also spreading misinformation. And so we are not doing it as researchers, but we are sharing this platform, and some may see that as an ethical challenge. And I think we have to be upfront with this. And I have some recommendations for digital demography using digital trace data that I'm going to come to in a second. Okay, so this was another activity that we're not going to do. But I have these good practices, these 4 good practices for demography that I've been compiling for digital demography. So the first one is acknowledge the non-representativeness of your data, and like bragging about the size of the data set is not enough if it's not representative. Use real-life data to compare and complement your findings from online sources. Account for drifting and different types of drifting, and for algorithmic confounding. Right, so this is the other thing. Are we observing a casino, or are we observing real life? Are we observing a setting that's designed to maximize some kind of behavior? And how might this affect our results? And be upfront and transparent about your choices. So this is everything that I had prepared. So maybe before we take some questions, if there are any, what I suggest that you spend some time on today is take a look at exercise 2. And so one thing that would be very useful also for the discussion, so we're going to have a closing discussion tomorrow, and it would be useful if you think if any of the content, any of the subjects, any of the tools that we have been discussing today, if they apply to your own research, and if they line up with some of your interests, in the sense that maybe you would like to do it at some point, or you just think it's very interesting how it intersects with other parts of your research. So just have a think and bring it to the discussion tomorrow. So that will be all from my side for today, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments. And also remember that you can email me if you have any specific question or thing you would like to discuss. Also, if you haven't figured out the R markdown.
I have a question, Diego. Heiner here.
Yeah.
How do you feel about splitting up these big companies and putting them under government control and force them to share their data and algorithms in a reasonable way for research?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm not sure about. So like one first thing to say, I think this is something that is like beyond that I cannot answer with like my digital demography hat on, because it's like in terms of what, in terms of like the privacy implications or like the economic consequences or our access for research. So I would just like answer this in terms of our access for research. So there is like one model which is it's like you force these companies somehow to provide access to governments. There is like another approach that is you create partnerships with companies, but then you are subject to these issues of like some having preferential treatment, as Andres mentioned. So there's another way, which is like there are already initiatives, and I can think of one called Project Opal as in the stone, which is intended to foster the development of infrastructure within companies that would allow the sharing of data for research. So the idea is like, so they call it, so not send the code to the data is how they put it. And the idea is that you have these systems in place that companies maintain. And as a researcher, you can send code to query the data and you can obtain the results back. So because usually like one big limitation is that if like a private company has like a department for research, then they have to deal with a lot of these technical things. And it's like a lot of time for them, so they usually don't want to do it. But if you have this infrastructure in place where, there's like a clear way, you just like get it, it's clear what you can get, then like researchers can get it. And it's like so like this type of partnership. So this is what I have seen, and that it's developing, and there are several initiatives to foster this kind of thing. Like in terms of enforcement, I wouldn't want to say anything more about that.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, so we finish for today. Thank you again. And I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Diego.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
you.